Welcome to Around the Empire, the show that takes you around the U.S. empire. I'm your host, Dan Wright.
I'm your host, Joanne Leon.
And on today's show, July 6th, 2018, we speak with Peter Lee, a.k.a. China Hand, a writer and analysis of East Asian geopolitics about the increasing U.S.-China tensions, trade wars, peace on the Korean Peninsula, and the fate of Taiwan. Here is that interview.
Today we're talking with Peter Lee, a.k.a. China Hand, friend of the show, and he's returning to the show. Thanks for coming back, Peter. It's great to see you.
Great to be here.
What's up, Pete?
Hot in California, that's all.
Hot in New Jersey, too.
Yeah.
So the headlines today say that a trade war with China begins today. Some people are even saying we're kicking off a 50-year trade war with China. That wasn't exactly what we were going to talk about today, but I guess it was one of the things. And, you know, since it's in the headlines, maybe let's start with that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there is a trade war that started today, and it's a little different from the past trade wars, which were more about incremental advantage on, leveling the playing field, increasing U.S. exports, gaining more market access. This is really more of a China rollback strategy, in my opinion. The whole idea behind it is to wrong foot and if not cripple, then slow down China and do that by messing up its trade relations with the United States and around the world.
Yeah, well, that doesn't sound good. What's Xi Jinping or what's China doing in response to that?
Well, though it hasn't been acknowledged, the United States has been in rollback mode on China ever since the beginning of the Obama administration. It was run by Hillary Clinton. And what's happening now is simply that it's escalated. And the Chinese have been, Xi Jinping has been putting measures in place to counter, an anticipated U.S. rollback effort, more aggressive in the South China Sea, more aggressive on trade and technology, cyber war, and so on. So this is no surprise to him. I'd say the main difference with Trump than if Hillary Clinton was president is that Trump, instead of turning it up to 10, is going to turn it up to 11. And the context is that we're dealing with, I think, something of a sociopath here in Donald Trump, and he's not really too concerned about collateral damage. And so, for instance, $34 billion of tariffs on Chinese exports to the United States is going to hurt some American importers and users of Chinese components in the supply chain. But and of course, the Chinese have made a specific effort to heighten the pain for Republican districts. But I don't think that's going to sway Donald Trump too much. He just wants to take out the big hammer and take a few whacks at China.
Yeah, I see the Wall Street Journal has an article. It says the title is China's Retaliation to U.S. Tariffs Will Hit American Soybean Farmers, Automakers, and Oil Producers and Have the Greatest Effect on Counties that Voted for Trump. So it's his own voters. Are they smart enough to target so-called red states and red districts?
Well, the Chinese have always had this politically directed trade policy. It was pretty simple. When they were having problems with the United States, they'd go and buy a few Boeing planes and buy soybeans. Those were their two big things. And now it's gotten a little more granular and a little more sophisticated. However, I think that since this is part of a Pentagon, NatSec community, Beltway rollback priority, the concerns of the little guy, the soybean farmer, and so on are, going to be taken into account, but they're not going to be driving the process. The Pentagon wants to take a piece out of China, and the trade war is one of the ways they're doing it. One of the things that I think was not covered, we basically think of Trump as, a knuckle-dragging goon, but there is some logic behind, these import bans. It's supposed to use the pain, I think, to force China out of the American supply chain and get American importers to turn to more politically favored sourcing, places like India, maybe even Vietnam, Indonesia, all those places. And the idea is to isolate China and decrease its leverage on the U.S. economy. So there is a China rollback logic to this. beyond the simple trade war huffing and puffing.
Yeah, I read that somewhere today. That the idea is to basically force our corporations or our industries to be less reliant on China.
Yeah, there was if you're students of Cold War history, the whole containment strategy comes out of George Kennan's long telegram written under the pseudonym of X, in which he says that the Soviet Union is going to try to isolate itself from influence by the West and enter into a period of economic autarky, which will lead to its collapse. And, he was pretty right about that. And the Chinese learned that lesson. And so they specifically went out and integrated themselves in the world economic system and the world trade system so that there would be this sort of mutual hostage taking. And now Donald Trump is trying to break or weaken that relationship so it's easier to beat up on China.
Is that part of his geostrategy, though? Do you think he has this? I mean, it seems so visceral that it's kind of like, well, we're getting ripped off, which is, objectively, we do run a big trade deficit with China. We run a trade deficit with a lot of countries. But is he part of this strategy, or do you think he's kind of being coached along by hawks?
Well, I think that Donald Trump, a lot of the stuff that happens in Trump land is a thing of where people who have agendas, for the Middle East, for the economy, for the environment, have given Trump political support in return for being able to shape the execution of his agenda. So, in just to say, in simpler terms, the Pentagon has had a hard-on for China ever since 1979, and now there's a real sense of urgency. China is approaching military parity in the Taiwan Strait, and so the uniformed military has pretty much positioned itself as one of Trump's most reliable sources of political and institutional support. And in return, Trump, I think, is on the visceral level, he understands who's got power, who's ready to put their shoulders to the wheel on his behalf. And he was always a big, bash the Orientals type of trade hawk. But I think that in terms of the actual execution of it now, he's basically taking his cues from some people who have been thinking about this for the last 30 years and preparing for this day when, it was time to put a stop to the growth of China and Chinese power.
Right, because it seems like when you tap into his id a little bit about it, because he's kind of in a time warp a lot of the times when he talks about these issues. Like, he keeps talking about Japan and how and it's really like, an 80s flashback almost, where he keeps talking about Japan is destroying this. You did this a lot during the campaign. A lot of people were kind of scratching their heads like, is Japan a major threat to United States trade? But remember, in the 80s, the specter of Japan coming in and buying Rockefeller Center and all these other things was like a big deal. There was movies made about it, right? Gung Ho and all these. It was a real cultural phenomenon, and I almost think like Trump's kind of stuck in a time warp.
Yeah, Japan was the China of the 1980s. It's true. And so when I look at Trump's personal feelings, I think that, he has this, he probably has a rather simplistic view of trade relations out there. But like I said, he's not the one who's implementing the specific agenda here. So one of the key tells in China hawking land was when Randy Shriver was nominated and approved as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia. Shriver came out of Bob Altman's shop. Bob Altman is an old school Cold Warrior. He was the guy who told Pakistan they would bomb them into the Stone Age if they didn't assist in the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11. Anyway, so Randy Shriver is a hardcore China hawk. He's a major promoter of enhanced relations with Taiwan. And he also was the director of a think tank called Project 2049. And that one was basically designed to make sure that the People's Republic of China did not make it past 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic. So there's all sorts of China hawking think tanks. There's defense money. There's a lot of people who are committed to shaping the agenda to turn China into an existential enemy, and of course, have a arms buildup and a diplomatic realignment based on that. And so the current trade war with China is more economic warfare, and that's, I think, simply one element of what the China hawks are trying to execute.
So your recent China watch and the promo text that came with it, you say a few interesting things here. You say Asia is following its own path, and before America can catch up, it has to understand what's going on. That's going to be tough for a superpower laser focused on denying its decline and obsessed with sustaining 60 years of hegemonic glory. I mean, I think that, to me, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but that seems like the bottom line. It's, wanting to prevent the sort of inevitable decline of the American empire and trying to maintain dominance. I mean, I've heard you talk about it. I've read Pepe Escobar, and I think everybody sort of recognizes this, even though it gets simplified down to, the Pentagon seeing China as a threat, as a great power competitor, which is great for the arms industry, and Trump's view that it's sort of predatory economics, as Pepe Escobar put it. I mean, isn't that what it all boils down to? Aren't we seeing Asia now strong enough, led by China, now strong enough to follow its own path, as you say? And we have the One Belt, One Road. We have other programs that I'm not too familiar with, the Chinese Dream, the Made in China 2025. I mean, is this the American empire looking at all this happening and saying, oh shit, we got to do something, and we got to do something fast?
Well, that's basically my take on it. I'm pretty cynical, especially as I get older, I get more cynical. And it seems to me is that a lot of talk of sustaining what we call the liberal international order is actually simply about sustaining hegemony. And the point of sustaining hegemony is that it provides a sense of importance and a big payday for a lot of influential and powerful people. Asia is definitely drifting away from the United States, and we're trying to cling to it with a variety of security and economic measures. The funny thing about the last 20 years is that China had rather intelligently counter-programmed against the U.S. obsession with putting everything in terms of security and defense against aggression by going with the economic argument, supporting economic integration as something that would be attractive to a lot of Asian states. And that has always been a tough nut to crack for the United States in saying, you have to be lockstep U.S. allies. You cannot, let China invest in your country too much. You cannot let them build roads and bridges and do BRI over there. It's always been a tough sell. And I think what we're seeing right now is really the last gasp of that strategy. Under the Obama administration, President Obama and some of the moderates around him were saying, well, economic integration is good. We can work with that. There was even talk of joining the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which was the Chinese bank for the BRI. But now, if you've followed the coverage in the press, the Belt and Road Initiative is evil. It's in Western media parsing. It is a tool of Chinese aggression. And so what we're seeing here is the United States is trying to win the debate on Chinese intentions and actions in the economic realm, which I do not think in the long term is ever going to work. So as long as China has the good sense to stay out of a military dust-up, as the economic arguments continue and China continues to grow, the clout of the United States in Asia will decrease. I think at our height, we had 50% of the world's GDP, and now we've got 25% of the world's GDP, maybe 22%. And the reality in Asia is that as good capitalists, everybody follows the money.
Well, I mean, it does seem like a good idea to be a little bit more self-sufficient from I don't know if you call that a nationalist standpoint, but I mean, what if China decides to, wage economic war against us, what if other people do?
Yeah.
We're going to be in pretty bad shape.
Well, I think that China is not economically terribly robust, if I may use that term, and the United States is prepared to kick China's ass if China tries to escalate the trade war. One of the things that I think is not particularly well covered in the mainstream press is the issue of China's high-tech ambitions. You referenced something called Made in China 2025, which is a Chinese agenda to move China out of the low-end export processing thing into the higher-end, more technical products. And that is key, not necessarily because it's a tool of Chinese world domination, but because it puts China into more direct competition with not only the United States, but also Germany and other EU high-tech manufacturers. Now, the thing to remember about that is that everything that China does in high tech, they are hopelessly dependent upon imported semiconductors. Now, the reason that Donald Trump decided to squeeze China's nuts on ZTE and telecom is not necessarily because these corporations are a genuine threat to American national security. It's because China imports $200 billion a year worth of high-performance semiconductors from Taiwan, from South Korea, from the United States, and it is reliant on the West for 90% of its semiconductor needs. And so when Donald Trump said that Qualcomm would no longer sell to ZTE, that was simply showing that card, that if things really get intense between the United States and China, then the Chinese will be looking at a major cutoff of their semiconductor purchases, and their high-tech end of their economy will suffer severely.
Don't they have a similar stranglehold on rare earth?
I think the rare earth thing is like total horseshit. I wrote about that in 2011.
Really?
And, yeah, that was the first. That was a time when the Chinese were trying to retaliate against the Japanese for some stunt where the Japanese seized a Chinese fishing vessel. And so they diddled with the rare earth exports. And Hillary Clinton and the Japanese government turned this into a huge thing about how we were, at the mercy of China rare earths blackmail. And that's just not the case. They're called rare earths, but they're not rare. They're all over the world. And the biggest mine is in Colorado in the United States. The reason that China dominates the rare earths is they had some big deposits there. And also the rare earths manufacturing industry is extremely dirty. Nobody wants to do it. Chinese are willing to do it. But anyway, China's going to be a net importer of rare earths in about 10 years. So we'll have that stranglehold on them.
Well, isn't there a larger point here, I think, in terms of the U.S. position on this? And we talk about the decline of empire is, I can remember if you look at the history, the slow rapprochement, initially it was, who lost China? That was in the 1950s, right? And there was all this recrimination. We now are in an era of neo-McCarthyism, but the original McCarthyism actually stemmed a lot from paranoid rantings of who lost China and how did China go communist, which, of course, even the phrasing of that, like who lost China, would, implies that it was ours to begin with, right? Who lost it? It was ours. Yeah. And so it seems like this slow process in the Vietnam War you can look at as kind of a paranoia about Chinese power and trying to contain it. And so now we are in this, for this brief period, at least when it was in our interest to this triangular diplomacy to go against the Soviets with Soviet-Sino split, we had this business relationship where basically China was able to stay safe by bribing Wall Street, and Wall Street bribed the U.S. government in turn. And it was sort of, well, we'll live and let live. There were still little, penetrations of that piece, namely there was a spy plane incident that people remember, which was a total setup by the U.S. government. They had a spy plane downed, and it was clear, almost, I think, one of the most obvious acts of provocation I've ever seen. But it ultimately calmed down, and people said, look, we're not going to go to war with China. We're not going to change our relationship. We're making too much money. And now it seems interesting that despite all these interrelationships, or what Niall Ferguson, the neocon historian, calls Chimerica, and all these, it seems like we're in another who lost China, or rather fine, we lost China, but we're not going to lose the rest of East Asia.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Yeah, there has been a entire bayoneting the wounded, as I call, exercise in basically sticking it to more moderate China hands in the United States. The patron saint of the China Hawks now is a guy at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton called Aaron Friedberger, and his big shtick is saying that moderates were. I should not put words in that man's mouth, but the China Hawk motif is that there was appeasement and delusion about whether China could be incorporated into the liberal international order. Now, I don't really think a lot of people actually believe that. I think a lot of people thought, well, we can manage China by making money off of it. But when you hear stuff like that, it's basically a slam on the moderates in the Obama administration because they were considered to be insufficiently militant in confronting the Chinese in the South China Sea and on the economy and on tech. And what we're really seeing is a purge of moderates in the U.S. foreign policy and think tank establishment. So, for instance, the last moderate standing in the Trump administration was Susan Thornton, who was the State Department's Assistant Secretary for East Asia, and she just announced her retirement. And that's taken pretty much as a signal that we're moving on a war footing with China, at least economic war, tech war, and that sort of stuff. And, if the Pentagon has its way, maybe a shooting war as well.
Well, I mean, Peter, maybe I missed something here, but I see a lot of from analysis, and you're doing the important work here with the think tank, which people should actually pay attention to. As boring as these people are, they actually kind of matter. But
yeah,
what I've noticed about the Trump clique is like Peter Navarro, that guy was irrelevant. I mean, I don't see him as part of maybe I'm wrong about this. I don't see him and some of these other people that, Michael Anton, these other people and even Bannon to some degree, I thought they were fringe, whereas the mainstream sort of China hawks are more from the neocon establishment or from the traditional, maybe neoliberal con establishment, Brookings, the other places. And so it's funny that Trump I thought, brought in people who were antagonistic to China, but also people who weren't really in the quote unquote anti-China establishment, if that makes sense. Or am I missing something?
Well, I think that, there's a certain grumpiness among the think tanks because Trump did marginalize the think tanks when he came into office. I don't know if you recall or not, but there was this letter, this public letter by, I think it was dozens of Republican foreign policy think tankers here opposing Trump's campaign and pledging their support to Hillary Clinton. And those people were put on a blacklist when Trump unexpectedly won. One of them was that guy I was talking about, Randy Shriver, actually his boss, Bob Altman. And so what it is, though, I think, is that, Trump gets a few high-profile flamethrowers in there, but the key element in China policy now is that the Pentagon and the Beltway think tanks are all pushing China is exporting a liberal authoritarianism line as a reason to give the Pentagon what it wants, do lots of pushback, and there's support for the trade war. There's not that much support actually for the whole tariff thing, but there's the idea of extorting improved market access from China, weakening China's access to high tech, more onerous review of Chinese investments in the United States. That all has a broad beltway support. In terms of Trump's brinkmanship and dingbattery, the hawks like to criticize, but on the substantive points, we're basically into a new Cold War with China. And the people in academia and in the think tanks and in the bureaucracy who are not supporting that are in a distinct minority. And it's not just Trump and John Bolton in the White House. This whole China policy thing has broad institutional support throughout Washington.
And the delicious irony of all that is that these people who are screeching, and there really is the word for it, about Trump and autocracy and all this stuff, at the same time are trying to turn around and talk about American liberal order and the American liberal democratic project, and that's what China and all these quote, Asiatic powers are bucking and they're trying to destroy this, and look what's happening. But how do they square that circle? I mean, they keep saying Trump is this autocrat and authoritarian. The Republican Party has lost all its democratic pretense. And at the same time, taking on China and saying, well, China's an authoritarian regime.
Yeah, I find that very amusing myself. The American exceptionalism has become an extremely tough road to hoe these days. And so, it's one of those things where we're flaying the Chinese, and at the same time, the foreign policy establishment is flaying Trump. Now, I would say that is an unsupportable contradiction, but these think tanks, they're mainly in the business of advancing a security narrative that benefits defense contractors, and so it's I think it's gonna keep happening, and it doesn't seem like there's any cognitive dissonance. When you look at the New York Times and the Washington Post, they've pretty much, especially from what I read of the New York Times, heck, on the Washington Post too, they pretty much signed on the China containment agenda, and so they're not going to complicate that with what's known as whataboutism. What about Trump?
Yeah, well, the commissars of Boeing, or whatever you want to talk about it, are, but their case is so weirdly phrased. I just wonder if if it's not so cynical and crass that they're just trying to get paid rather than win an ideological war, which it seems like. That's the thing. There's these grand pronouncements from all these establishment media institutions and think tankers, mostly tank, less think. Mm-hmm. And at the end of it, it's kind of, it all falls rather flat. And it even, I think, falls flat in elite circles. It certainly falls flat on the public, who doesn't care anyway, but it falls flat even in the elite circles because they can't get a coherent. This isn't the Cold War. People are trying to restart the Cold War for a number of reasons, not least of which is the jobs program for the think tankers. But they can't really, they know the music, but they don't know the tune type deal. It just doesn't see, it always seems like it's falling flat. It seems like it's so obviously falling flat, even they know it's falling flat.
Yeah. Well, the trouble is that China, has not done a lot of really overtly militarily aggressive stuff. There have been these tiny border incidents down in India. They're doing bad things to the Uyghurs in the West, but there's nothing that puts is putting the fear of China into the U.S. public. But it's interesting.
Oppressing Muslims, I'm not sure, is really where we're going to take, not the hill we're going to die on.
Yeah, well, most people can't find China on the map, let alone Xinjiang. So I think there's a problem there, but it's not for lack of trying. I think that the whole Uyghurs in concentration camp thing is there. It's getting a lot of push from Radio Free Asia, from the liberal press, from Amnesty, and all those people. But as I said, it doesn't engage the American voter viscerally. But nowadays you don't have to. You can cook up anything. One of the most interesting things I was just thinking about was the reason that we have to stigmatize China as exerting a liberal authoritarian influence is because at the same time the United States is putting on a major push to impose liberal authoritarian direction over its allies, particularly the Five Eyes, the intelligence community of Canada, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. I've written a lot about how they're having a major anti-China influence campaign in Australia, which I believe was one of the brainwaves of Hillary Clinton and Kurt Campbell, because the idea is that the work in Asia, the intelligence work, the surveillance work, the blah de blah, is being outsourced to Australia, and the Australian government has signed on. At the same time, they're doing this major campaign to root out Chinese influence in Australian politics. Of course, everybody in the Australian military, security, and government apparatus has property of the United States tattooed on their ass. So you have to have this rather one-sided propaganda campaign to say we're fighting Chinese influence. And I think, it really is hard to whip up enthusiasm for that. But right now, the security services are basically leaking information to the big papers in order to generate what shall I say, concern, anxiety, fear, panic about the China threat. And it happens in Australia, it happens in the United States, just happened in Germany. I don't know if you noticed that or not, but it looks like the security services there leaked a report that the Chinese were spying on the German parliament. So, I'd say the campaign to stigmatize and exclude China, it might not be working at the popular level, but at the elite level, it's basically the default now.
Well, there was an elite panic. I mean, this should be noted. The Project 2025 that was a panic induced. It seemed to have a little bit more substance to it because it hit people in the wallet. I mean, it was totally of course, yes, China would like to be part of artificial intelligence. Yes, China would like to be part of all these new technologies, but China is in no position to really take the lead on any of those things currently. But it became useful, at least from what I see, to scare the crap, particularly out of Europe. Yeah, like they're coming for your jobs. They're coming for your jobs.
They are coming for your jobs, and the funny thing, by the way, is that when you look at the 2025 punch list, it's not just, scary stuff like artificial intelligence. It's like, we're going to become a major shipbuilder, and that sort of stuff. We're going to build construction equipment, and that sort of stuff. All these things where they've been doing a lot of licensing and assembly, they wanted to have their own technology. But yeah, what apparently got Angela Merkel's attention was when this Chinese auto outfit Geely accumulated a big stake in Daimler-Benz, and those are the crown jewels for Germany. And they, as long as Germany has undisputed sway in the upper end of the economic sphere, they're going to be pretty relaxed about everything else. But, that was one of those things which they pushed back, and the Chinese yield a little bit. There's a lot of that goes on. The Chinese try to get what they can, and when there's pushback, they retreat. So that was normal. That I saw as normal trade stuff. The Made in China 2025 thing, I just think of as total propaganda, agitprop, bullcrap stuff.
Can I just read something here from an Escobar article about Made in China 2025 targets? He says they target 10 techno-strategic fields: information technology, including 5G networks and cybersecurity, robotics, aerospace, ocean engineering, high-speed railways, new energy vehicles, power equipment, agricultural machinery, new materials, and biomedicine. I mean, that's a very broad.
Yeah, they target. I mean, but can they actually pull any? I mean, that's. That China is going to suddenly be a competitor with agricultural technology, competing against $1 trillion subsidized. Yeah, it's like, yeah, we would like to be the leaders. I mean, doesn't every company say that? Doesn't every? I don't know, Peter. Am I off base here?
No, I think you're. I'm a cynic, so of course, yeah, I agree. But the interesting thing was the 5G network was taken as the rallying cry for the China Hawks. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the National Security Council, some Air Force general on the council, floated the idea that we should have a nationalized, state-run 5G network, because that would stick it to the Chi-Coms, and we would control this strategic technology ourselves. So 5G is the big buzzword now, because that's going to be the thing that not only powers smartphones, it's going to be the thing that controls your driverless car. It's considered to be one of these game changer technology things, and that's the hill that the China Hawks decide to die on. That we have to keep China out of 5G. So
we must protect against a 5G gap.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I find the whole thing terrifying because they'll be putting these high frequency microwave transponders in every 10 feet on the freeway and stuff. We're just going to get cooked. The so-called Chinese 5G threat was the basis for denying the acquisition of Qualcomm by Broadcom. It was the basis for cutting off ZTE's supply of Qualcomm chips. Now ZTE and Huawei are banned from the U.S. backbone, ostensibly on security concerns. Australia, always the first adopter in these things, have also banned. So there's a big push that 5G is not going to be China's ticket to the technical big time. And I think it'll work because of the complete reliance of Chinese electronics manufacturers on imported chips, which, in an interesting aside, the top chips all come from Taiwan.
So, Peter, they're trying to essentially limit China, cut them out, leverage the supply chain, but at the same time, they're saying, why won't China integrate into the international order? Yeah. So how do those two things conflict? It seems like on a larger scale, you have people complaining about a lack of integration while actively trying to kick them out of the system or prevent their integration.
Well, as I see it, China played by the rules and bent the rules in the world trade system and profited immensely. And so now the Trump administration has decided to throw out the rule book because the best defense against the Chinese continuing in their successful exploitation of the world economic system is for the United States to go unilateral and do things on a national security basis as opposed to the liberal international order basis. So Team Trump actually, a document came out where they talked about withdrawing from the WTO. And again, that's very much part of the neocon and Pentagon, I think, mindset, where you cannot circumscribe America's ability to act unilaterally and outside the international system when core U.S. Interests are at stake. So the whole kumbaya, we're going to integrate China into the international order thing is dead because China did too good a job. So it's time to kick them out.
Fair enough.
You guys mentioned the Uyghurs, and I just wanted to tell you about something that Lawrence Wilkerson said in a recent speech about the Uyghurs. He was talking about why we are really in Afghanistan. And he named 3 reasons. One of them is to keep an eye, to be close to Pakistan in case there are some problems with their nukes. Someone gets a hold of them that we don't want to have them. And the second thing he said was that our military is there as a cover for CIA operations over the border in China, the Uyghur population, and other, whatever you want to call it, color revolution, regime change, that kind of thing. And then the third thing he said was to just meddle with the One Belt, One Road, whatever portion of it is intended to come through Afghanistan, to throw a wrench in the works there, if not shut it down altogether. I just thought you might find that interesting.
Well, I agree with Colonel Wilkerson's assessment there. I will add one comment, is that China is embarked in an unprecedented exercise in social and ethnic engineering in Xinjiang. They have a right to be paranoid about foreign support for Uyghur separatism and terrorism. There were significant numbers of Uyghurs who went to Syria with the connivance of the Turkish government to fight in northern Syria, and now they're coming back, and it looks like some of them are trying to sneak in through an ISIS affiliate, ISIS Khorasan, in Afghanistan. So there are plenty of reasons for the Chinese to want to lock down Xinjiang. But I think in a broader context, this thing where they're putting hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs into what are called re-education camps is part of a demographic engineering project. The Chinese, I think, have studied, what happened in Chechnya. They've studied what's going on in Gaza and Palestine, and they're trying to leverage their advantages to do it in a better way, which means totally divide the Uyghur population and cow them and with extensive surveillance. And I saw an article in Global Times today, which I think connected a few dots for me. It said that 460,000 Uyghurs are going to be resettled, already have been resettled out of economically backward areas, which also happen to be the areas of greatest unrest. And so they're slicing and dicing the Uyghur demographic there in order to integrate Xinjiang completely into the Chinese social and economic polity. They're considered to be an impediment to the Hanification of the West and an impediment to the security and stability of that now extremely critical Central Asian outpost for China.
Well, isn't that kind of an act of weakness, though, Peter? Because the whole Hanification, if I know my history, and obviously you'd know it better than me, is that they would actually eventually conquer the people who invaded because their culture was so influential that the Mongolians would invade and then they'd become Han Chinese because the Han culture was so powerful. The fact that they feel Hanification now requires these salami tactics, it's kind of a admission of lack of cultural confidence, isn't it?
Yeah, well, actually, it is a very interesting question in Chinese history. In that there have been a lot of non-native dynasties, and the traditional take was that the Chinese Borg, absorbed these these foreign horsemen and turned them into Chinese. Apparently, from scholarly point of view, the truth is a little more complicated, and China is currently fighting a battle against what they call historical nihilism, which is a rather well-founded criticism of this whole "there's always been a continual China" thing. In Japan, the right-wingers in Japan actually repudiate the idea that China actually exists. Kind of interesting. And so anyway, that's strictly as a grace note to indicate, they're not very, the Uyghurs hate them out there, the Xinjiang pacification and occupation was by the rather brutal elements of the PLA. And another problem is that the Chinese Communist Party has never had a particularly robust and effective cadre system out there. So they tried to do this half-assed hearts and minds thing out there, and the Uyghurs just kept getting more and more alienated. So now the whole thing has been turned into this super high-tech technocratic project. Yeah, the CCP and Xi Jinping, they worry a lot about Xinjiang. The good thing for them is there are only 10 million Uyghurs and there's 1.6 billion Chinese, which is really the main basis for their confidence that they'll be able to successfully pacify that part of China.
By sheer numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And the military part of it, too. Let's go back to Taiwan. You mentioned that Taiwan, the Pentagon has their eye on Taiwan for beachhead. What did you mean by that?
Well, I'm old enough to remember when there were dozens of U.S. military bases on Taiwan. It was called our unsinkable aircraft carrier. Douglas MacArthur gave Taiwan that name. And the U.S. military has never been particularly happy that they were forced to leave Taiwan. At one time, the Philippines was sort of a consolation prize, but we're not doing that good in the Philippines. We got kicked out of Clark and Subic Bay, and we have to do these weird, rotational things and port calls through the Philippines. So the Pentagon has always, lusted for upgrades of the Taiwan relationship, and now there's open talk, both in the Pentagon and at think tanks and in Taiwan itself, of reintegrating Taiwan into the Asian security architecture as a U.S. asset. Now, I assume that, we always do this. We've always had ships go there, to keep our foot in the door and that sort of stuff. But the current government of Taiwan is pro-independence. It's run by the Democratic Progressive Party, and the president is Tsai Ing-wen, and they are openly, at loggerheads with the Chinese and with the mainland, and their primary orientation now is both to the United States and to Japan. So Japan finds it very profitable to diddle the Chinese by covertly developing relations with Taiwan. So the big news, other than Randy Shriver, who had been decorated by the Taiwan government for services rendered, other than Randy Shriver becoming the point man for the Pentagon in Asia, the big news was that we built another pseudo embassy in Taiwan, and it was announced last week that the State Department had requested that 40 Marines be sent as a detachment to guard the American Institute in Taiwan, which is what we call our embassy over there. So there's continual upgrade of relationship, and the basis for the idea that Taiwan can resist Chinese displeasure is, as I pointed out, the dominance of Taiwan's semiconductor foundries in the physical production and supply of chips to China.
But this is the one China policy is pretty, well, it seems insurmountable. Is there anything we could actually do outside of military response if China decides to finally incorporate Taiwan? They openly say it's our right. They're, they belong to us or they're Chinese, which they have some point. I mean, it was Chiang Kai-shek, right, that went into Taiwan and then made it a best. So, I mean, what is there anything the U.S. can actually do other than put our own Marines in harm's way and hope that China won't do anything?
Well, actually, the United States, by the way, does not endorse the one China policy. We simply say we understand that China has a one China policy. And the other thing is that there's a big demographic split between mainlanders who came over with Chiang Kai-shek and local Chinese, ethnic Chinese who have been there since the Ming Dynasty, and also a small Aboriginal population, which is part of the whole Polynesian diaspora. Anyway, we're committed to defend Taiwan, and China apparently has not even gotten seriously interested in developing the amphibious forces that would be needed to fight its way past the Sixth Fleet and try to land on Taiwan and subjugate a country of 23 million people, most of whom would be very unhappy. So I don't really, I'm not one of those guys who sits awake at night and worrying that the Chinese are going to invade just because they want to reconquer Taiwan. But there's a lot of things that the United States can do, like they can redefine the defensive nature of the armaments that we sell to Taiwan to include dual use stuff, like submarines, hunter-killer submarines, and that sort of stuff. And I don't know if it's well known, but do you remember that whole thing about the THAAD radar in Korea?
Yeah, the system we're going to sell them that doesn't even work.
Well, the missile system doesn't work, but the radar works fine. And there's a $1.4 billion X-band radar identical to the one that we were trying to get into Korea, but much bigger, on the island of Taiwan. It's our major military asset on the island of Taiwan. And the whole idea is, then you got your nice high frequency radar coverage of the whole Chinese coast, and you got submarines, and maybe we'll sell them some more airplanes, and that sort of stuff. So, I think that as the population of mainlanders dies off, Taiwan is becoming more and more as a independent identity as people of Taiwan. So reunification is dead. The only question is, will they integrate economically with China, or will they turn to the United States and Japan? And Japan, as you may know, was a very popular colonizer of Taiwan from 1895 to 1945. The local Taiwanese were pretty happy with the Japanese, apparently.
Oh, really? So they were actually liked.
Yeah, especially when you compare to what the KMT did after they came over in 1949. And so it's two ends of the spectrum. The colonial administration of Japan in Korea was awful, but the colonial administration in Taiwan is seen as rather benign. And the father of Taiwan's independence, Lee Teng-hui, you remember him? He used to be president of Taiwan. He was the first non-KMT president. His brother died in the service of the Japanese Empire as a policeman, and he's enshrined at Yasukuni in Japan. And every once in a while, Lee Teng-hui goes over there and pays his respects at the Yasukuni shrine.
Yeah, talk about a split in history. I mean, the brutality of the Japanese occupation of China, the rape of Nanking, is a defining feature of Mao's so-called heroism. But the Taiwanese actually liked the Japanese occupiers. Well, so it's a fun fact of the day.
Yeah, so the Taiwanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they tweet in English and in Japanese, and Japanese the extreme right wingers have always had a very close and paternal interest in Taiwan and ties to the Independence Party there. So there's this big thing, So whenever you hear this thing about how Taiwan is under increased threat from the Chinese, that's bullshit. Basically what it is that it's now is the time is ripe, the iron is hot, it's time to strike on Taiwan, because the independence-minded government is there. They want to reorient their economy away from the mainland and towards Japan and the United States. And so we're always looking for excuses to up our cooperation with Taiwan. And pretty soon, I think that, the consensus will be, well, it's going to infuriate the Chinese, but let's just do it anyway. What the fuck?
So you're saying, basically, from what I understand here, is that the Chinese threats about, this is maybe the U.S. is hyping this, but that China's actually doesn't have a power play here to actually take Taiwan by force.
Yeah, they could screw up Taiwan. I mean, they could carpet it with missiles. That's the main threat. That in a war Taiwan would lose, but the war is not going to end with the PLA occupying Taiwan. And one of the things I think that's also less noticed is that that whole thing about the U.S. developing a doctrine to use low yield tactical nuclear weapons. That's I think in large part a response to the conventional arms that Taiwan is able to bring to bear in the Taiwan Strait and threaten our precious aircraft carriers, all those missiles. We want to be able to tell the Chinese that if things get out of hand in Taiwan, a nuke might get dropped on a Chinese naval base.
So is Taiwan the prize here, or is Taiwan just a buffer for U.S. influence in Asia, that it kind of keeps China in check, or it keeps the U.S. having a justifiable footprint, right? Because we're there by invitation when we collaborate, just like Japan. I don't understand what is the U.S., in your opinion, what's the U.S. view of Taiwan beyond something to poke China with when it wants to?
Well, mainly to poke China with. I mean, Taiwan's already in our pocket. The main problem was that they don't want to see Taiwan Finlandized and turned into a Chinese geostrategic partner. I always thought that the United States would have lost the struggle for hegemony in Asia when the People's Liberation Army Navy of China did a port call to Taiwan. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Oh, you're saying that would be the game over?
I'm just saying Taiwan, the demographics are in favor of independence and away from integration. The Taiwan government is doing a lot of stuff to increase the antagonism of towards the mainland. Exposing spy cases and basically ragging on the mainlanders. When there was some earthquake in southern Taiwan a few months ago, the Taiwan government made a big deal of accepting aid from Japan but spurning it from the mainland. It's all this thing about where we're turning away from the mainland. We're turning towards Japan and the United States. And, don't forget they'll also buy a lot of weapons. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce Taiwan is pretty much a Lockheed Martin subsidiary. And, there'll be a few $1 billion of sales of fighter planes and that sort of stuff. And
is that laundering, though? This is a key question. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, it's basically a kind of laundering operation. Well, or a racket, more like, we do this protection thing and you buy all these weapons. I mean, is Taiwan... They integrate them with the world system and will buy these weapons, or are they're just independent-minded people who want it?
Well, they're independent-minded people who want the continued support of the United States, and they don't want, they don't want a replay of Nixon goes to China where he just says, okay, well, bye-bye Taiwan. But, they did this thing. I think they bought a couple hundred Abrams tanks, and I think, what are they going to do with those?
Right.
But, you got to keep the Pentagon happy. And if the Pentagon says, well, your request to the U.S. Congress, it better have some of this stuff, I think they're going to do it.
All those tanks that Congress made the Pentagon buy, even though they didn't need them, I guess I could just give them to Taiwan.
Yeah, something like that. I saw that thing. I was thinking, God, what are they going to do with those tanks? It's not like they're going to have tank wars with the PLA on Taiwan. But there's other stuff. Those famous Senkaku Islands,
right?
Yeah,
the Diaoyutai Senkaku. They really belong to Taiwan geologically and historically. They're only a few miles from Taiwan, but the key tell will be if Taiwan ever surrenders its sovereignty on those islands to Japan. Which, that would certainly stick it into China's eye. The thing is that it was always supposed to be a three-way tussle over the Senkakus, and the previous president, Ma Ying-jeou, his signature political issue was keeping the Senkakus or the Diaoyutai Islands for Taiwan. And when Nixon did the settlement over Okinawa and all those islands up there, he specifically excluded the Senkakus because he didn't want to stick it to Taiwan too badly. So those are the complicating fact for the United States is that we have never taken a position of sovereignty on those islands. We simply say Japan has administrative control. And so the Chinese say, well, look at that, butt out, America. You don't even have a position on these islands.
So in this formulation, I mean, it looks like the U.S. is setting itself up. Obviously, it wants to maintain a presence in East Asia, a sort of dominant influence. But when you look at why then resolve the Korea War? Should they even want to resolve the Korea War? Because
Well,
For
the
the Korean
Pentagon doesn't
conflict.
want to resolve the Korean War.
Right.
I mean, the Japan doesn't want to resolve the Korean War. I was always writing that the interests of the Pentagon was always in continuing the frozen conflict. Korea's got nukes. We don't try to get them to denuclearize. We go for deterrence, which means, of course, you get to put more military goodies out there. The bigger the threat, the bigger the footprint for the United States. And that was also a big thing for Japan, is that they had a convenient excuse to muscle up. The biggest story in Asia, other than the rise of China in the last decade, has been the return of Japan to, or approaching to, a full-fledged power projecting military state in Asia. They have the peacetime constitution. Now they've been slowly gutting that, and Abe's mission in life is to be able to dispatch the Japanese forces wherever he wants to. Right now, the Japanese army the Navy are called self-defense forces because they're not supposed to operate outside of Japanese territory. He wants to change that. And having a nice Korean threat was a good justification for it.
Oh, it's the 1930s all over again everywhere.
Yeah.
or even 1914. Some people are saying it's more like that, but I don't know. The Vladivostok Forum, I guess it was an economic forum. It was a number of months ago. I saw parts of that, some of the speeches, and both Koreas were there, and China was there, and pretty much all of the leaders of Asia were there, and there was an energy there that surprised me, and a determination that they had plans, and they really weren't going to let anyone get in their way. So with Korea, who is really driving this process? It looks much more like it's the Koreas themselves. Obviously, Kim Jong-un has gone, I think now 3 times to meet with Xi Jinping. And, Russia's there too. They've got a little border. They'd like to run a gas pipeline. They very much want to develop Northeast Asia. So, Peter, what's going on with Korea?
Okay. Yeah, well, Korea is really the most striking example of Asia for the Asians, because it's really being driven by Moon Jae-in, the president of the Republic of Korea, or South Korea. And of course, he was a pacifist, and opponent of the right wingers who totally discredited themselves with the impeachment or resignation of President Park. And he's really been the guy driving this process. It hasn't been Donald Trump. It hasn't even really been Kim Jong-il. Moon sees an opportunity to advance Korean integration, and he's going for it, even though he is, an American ally, and there's 33,000 U.S. troops still stationed in Korea. So that's one of those embarrassing things for the Pentagon, in terms of looking at their portfolio. Basically, Duterte is very negative on the United States. And here you have the Koreans, who are, playing footsie with Kim Jong-un. But and
we should also mention that all those troops are being, or most of them at least, are being concentrated and relocated. I think just this week there's a new military base called Fort Humphreys. It's a couple dozen miles further south of Seoul, and it's a brand new gig.
Yeah. And I don't know what they're doing there, quite frankly. They're not a trip line against the Koreans. My suspicion always was the only reason we keep land forces in Korea is if we're going to do an intervention in the case of the collapse of the North Korean state, in which case we go march into Pyongyang and do that. That doesn't seem as likely now, especially with this peace process. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were moving out sooner or later. It's not on the agenda right now for the peace talks or the denuclearization talks. The thing about Korea, I think, is that Korea is a $100 bill lying in the streets of Asia. It's got a relatively well-educated workforce that works for very low wages. It's got tremendous natural resources, not just minerals, but also hydropower. It's located in a very attractive neighborhood for infrastructure and all that sort of stuff. The idea that the United States could keep North Korea in cold storage and not let it develop economically and integrate with the rest of Asia was, I think, a position that became less and less tenable as time went on, and especially because whatever opportunities there were in North Korea were being totally dominated by the Chinese because of sanctions. So I think there's tremendous momentum behind Moon Jae-in's initiative to reach out for them, because that's the one chance that Korea, for the Koreans, is going to play out. And I think that the United States is really playing catch up here. We've been blinded by our alliance with Japan to ignore, what really are some strikingly strong trends on the Korean Peninsula towards integration.
Well, how does that end, do you think? I mean, I'm still trying to figure out. Yeah, I agree that the South Korea, which gets no media attention in the U.S., it's like the South Korean leadership doesn't even exist in the Western media. It's all Trump and maybe some Kim Jong-un, or Kim Jong-un's playing Trump, or, this is a disaster. And, but South Korea has like no agency. They're just apparently a totally vassal of the United States, when it does look like the South Korean political leadership is playing a role. But I don't know what integration looks like. Does it mean the border comes down? Does it mean, as Trump talks about, condos, McDonald's in North Korea? What does integration actually look like between North and South Korea?
They've always had, there's always been some minor export processing thing, but the main thing that's necessary for integration nowadays is for the sanctions to come down. And then probably the North Koreans will follow the Chinese model. They'll have a sort of an ink blot thing where they'll have a couple places where people can go hog wild and invest money and do export processing and that sort of stuff. And then they'll let it extend to the rest of the country. The orthodoxy used to be that the Kim dynasty could not open at all to the West, because once people got a look at the West, then they'd freak out and the government would fall. But I don't think that's the case anymore. One of the most interesting things was that when Kim Jong-un had his meeting with Trump in Singapore, North Korean television showed this 10-minute travelogue of the glories of Singapore. The message wasn't what you can't have this. The message was Kim Jong-un is going to get you this. So,
so the Chinese model then, controlled capitalism.
Exactly. And, the impulse towards integration has always been there. And one of the things that an anecdote I always like to talk about is that when Dick Cheney and George W. Bush in the George W. administration was screwing North Korea big time, it was the Axis of Evil days. Remember those?
Oh, yeah.
North Korea was a member of the Axis of Evil because otherwise it would have been too Muslim heavy. That came out later. He originally wanted to have Iran, Iraq, and Syria, but somebody said it's all Muslims. And so he says, okay, we'll put it.
David Frum, the king of civility and norms. That was his contribution, right?
Exactly. So when he was trying to screw over the North Koreans and basically torpedo the North Korean peace process back in like 2005 and instituted these draconian sanctions, the South Korean president was actually sending representatives with suitcases of money to the border to physically hand over to the North Koreans so that he could continue to execute the process. It's an interesting fact when you think about what's going to be happening with JCPOA, the Iran deal. There's going to be these attempts to keep it going, even though the United States has already pretty much threatened to sanction the bejesus out of anybody who does anything.
True. Oh, okay. So you're saying, so there might be a deal in Korea, and other countries might go along with the idea that they can do, FDI or have some sort of integration, and there might have to be this sort of because the Europeans are basically saying, like, look, we signed on to the Iran deal. They're complying as far as we're concerned. We're going to play, and the U.S. is saying, well, we'll sanction you, and that becomes this. So you think that could happen? There could be a Korean deal that the hawks ultimately don't want to go along with in the U.S., but now you have other people openly subverting it.
Yeah, that's, as I said, my basic take is that Donald Trump is a sociopath, which means that he is not emotionally invested in the idea that he'll actually bring peace and prosperity to North Korea. He wants to basically keep the optics train going until the midterms, and then I'm afraid that the whole Korean process will get rolled into the anti-China and anti-Iran thing, and he might use The Korean situation is another excuse to execute secondary sanctions against China, which is the true nuclear economic war option. The idea that any bank secondary sanctions means that China is cut off from the world banking system for its purported crimes against Iran sanctions and Korean sanctions, and that's a major thing that the Chinese have obsessed about for 15 years.
Oh, that would be catastrophic. But that would be catastrophic for a lot of people. That would come back on the U.S. pretty quickly. It would.
Yeah. Well, we're in the creative destruction mode again. We're going to knock over Iraq and we're going to make it better. Well, I always said, all these people are talking about, American leadership in Asia. Well, look what they did to, the Middle East and North Africa. But there's a good chance that Trump will just say, "Hey, we're going to totally screw over the Chinese," and at the end of it, we'll come out on top. And when you look at stuff like these trade barriers and sanctions and sort of stuff, maybe U.S. manufacturers take it in the shorts for 2 years, but then they get a better deal in India. Maybe the soybean manufacturers get shut out of China, but what happens when that does? The price of soybeans goes up, and they sell them somewhere else, So anyway, so the main thing about, Team Trump is he wants to show that he's not a wuss like Obama. And that was always the rap on Obama from the Pentagon. And so, there's this sort of institutional push for him to go to the wall. And, you look at Donald Trump, he's the kind of guy who would do it,
Yeah, he's the kind of guy who would go to the wall, not caring about the consequences, though. That was what restraint.
Consequences, schmonsequences is my feeling. The whole United States foreign policy is based on the idea of impunity. We get to dish it out. We never have to take it in. That's why 9/11 was such a big thing. Some people actually dared, inflict violence on the American homeland, and so we retaliated with a $3 trillion military campaign. But I think that still underlies a lot of the policy towards China. China militarily is seen as a paper tiger. They can't beat us. They haven't fought a war since they had a really lousy war with Vietnam in 1979. Their economy is rickety. It's an offense. Unlike
us, of course.
Yeah, well, what can I say? It's they haven't really achieved fiat currency status yet. So but like I said, though, they've been planning for this day for the last at least since the year 2000. Basically, their biggest gift was the war on terror, which basically took China off the radar. But now they're back, but they knew they'd be back. That's why I always laugh at these things where it says, "Oh, the Chinese, they overstepped." The Chinese always realize you got to grab as much as you can before Uncle Sam turns around and takes out the big stick. So I think the big stick is coming. It's going to be pretty nasty. That is my opinion.
Oh, I hope not. I really hope not. I kind of hope that we can't stop the Korean reunification process, but I think that's wishful thinking. So you think that basically after the midterms, they're just going to sabotage the deal and it's going to fall through and it's going to be everybody else's fault?
They're already sabotaging it, I just wanted to bring out one thing about the whole Korean Megillah is that the Pentagon's primo ally in Asia by far is Japan. And there's also a strong Japan faction in the State Department. The China faction, of course, has been totally gutted. And there's a very specific reason why Japan does not want to see normalization of relations with Korea. And I addressed this in a recent program I did. Japan has never paid any reparations to North Korea. Traditionally in the Asia after World War II, whenever Japan normalized relations with a country, they'd have to pay reparations. The United States specifically removed the obligations to pay immediate reparations by Japan in the San Francisco Peace Treaty back in, I think it was 1952, because they wanted to maintain Japan as a bulwark of anti-communism. So basically, the Japanese have gone and slow walked all their discussions with all these countries about, paying them back. So, for instance, South Korea, they got like $700 million from Japan in 1965, 20 years after the war had ended, in order to settle claims and normalize relations. China got $20 billion. My guess is that North Korea, which not only had Japanese colonial administration, the horrors of World War II, but also Japan was the rear base for the U.S. Air Force when it bombed the crap out of them. And then Shinzo Abe, inflicted a decade of economic sanctions on top of that. So I figure, the North Koreans, they already hinted at it. They're going to ask for, tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of reparations. And the main source of those are going to be from Japan. So Shinzo Abe has no interest in that. And the Pentagon has really no interest in seeing a strong communist North Korean administration. So, yeah, I think that after the midterms and Trump gets whatever he's going to get, the knives will come out. We're already seeing a drip of leaks from Japan undercutting the peace talks. We're seeing Pentagon stuff. We saw that stuff that I just did a program on it about the Ken Delanian, the CIA's mop-up guy, coming out with these negative assessments that said that North Korea was still refining plutonium. And so that stuff will just continue. And whether Donald Trump decides he wants to shoot for the Nobel Prize by actually concluding a peace deal, or he wants to keep the Pentagon off his back, and, with Shinzo Abe, it's anybody's guess. And I think that he's going to at least keep the process going, through November. I think Kim Jong-un is going to come to the United States in September or October or something like that. But, after that, he might just decide, I got a China economic war going on. I got my Iran sanctions. I don't know if I really need to kiss Kim Jong-un's ass anymore. That sort of thing.
His ass, he has to do something, right? I mean, that's the problem with the rhetoric that got so hot. I mean, if this deal falls apart, it's kind of hard to just say, "Oh well," right?
I do not see that as the Trump modus operandi.
Oh, you think he's going to memory all
that? He would just say, "Yeah, I always said this guy was a liar," and maybe I'll bomb him next week. No, So yeah, I don't think the foolish consistency that is the hobgoblin of small minds is really a concern for Donald J. Trump. So yeah, it could get pretty hairy over there, I think.
Oh boy. Well, on that happy note, we're kept you for a long time here, Peter. Do you guys have anything else you want to throw in before we wrap up?
No, where can people find your work, Peter?
I do most of my work for newsbud.com, which is an independent media site. It's a subscription-only site, but I believe that this weekend, that is the weekend of July 6th, we're going to put up a non-paywalled report on Korea, and we'll also include my report on one of the most important but little-known events in Asian history as far as the United States is concerned, which was the totally botched secondary sanctions campaign of 2006 that directly birthed North Korea's atomic bomb. And you can find that at Newsbud.
Don't miss that.
Thank you.
That's newsbud.com.
That's newsbud.com, yeah. There'll
on
be
Twitter, he's China Hand.
And also I have a blog called China Matters. Not the China Matters out of Australia, which is some sort of like right-wing NatSec site. It's chinamatters.blogspot.com, and I post for that when I can.
And it's excellent, by the way.
Thank you.
All right, then. Thanks so much. It's always great to talk to you.
It was great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming, Peter.
Okay.
All right. Take care.
You too.
And that's our show. I want to thank you for listening, and a special thank you to Peter Lee. Follow Peter on Twitter at ChinaHand. Follow his work at Newsbud's China Watch and at his China Matters blog.
We're independent media. We rely on your contributions. This podcast is brought to you with the help of our generous donors. You can pitch in by going to patreon.com/aroundtheempire, by doing donation using our website aroundtheempire.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and our podcast channels at iTunes and other podcast apps. On YouTube, it helps a lot if you hit the subscribe button. That's free to subscribe to the channel. And also use the thumbs up icon to like the videos. Also, please like our page on Facebook.
Follow us on Twitter at Around the Empire. Follow me at US Empire Show. Follow Joanne at Joanne Leon, Leon. Questions, comments, want to yell at me? Dan at AroundTheEmpire.com. See you next time.
Take care, everyone.